Deep in the heart of Maine, surrounded by dense, whispering pines, lay Blackwood Lake. Its surface was perpetually dark, reflecting only fragments of light that managed to break through the towering canopy above. The lake had a sinister reputation, a history woven with eerie tales of disappearances, ghostly apparitions, and inexplicable phenomena. For generations, the locals of Pine Creek avoided the lake, warning newcomers with grim stories passed down through hushed voices. It wasn't just superstition, too many strange things had happened. Yet, for the town's youth, Blackwood Lake was the ultimate test of bravery. On a crisp October evening, a group of teenagers, Kate, Tommy, Jess, and Ben, drove out to the lake. Kate, a fearless girl with a fascination for the paranormal, had convinced her friends to spend the night there. "Come on," she'd said earlier, her green eyes sparkling with excitement. "If the lake is haunted, don't you want to see it for yourself? We'll make it an adventure." Tommy, her best friend since childhood, was reluctant. He had always been the cautious one, but Kate's enthusiasm was contagious. Jess, ever the skeptic, rolled her eyes at the idea but agreed, not wanting to be left out. Ben, the group's self-proclaimed comic relief, pretended not to be scared but packed a flashlight big enough to double as a weapon. They arrived at the lake just as the sun dipped below the horizon. The woods around it were eerily quiet, the usual rustling of leaves replaced by an unsettling stillness. Kate led the way, holding a vintage lantern she'd found in her grandfather's attic. "This is the perfect spot," she declared, stopping near the shoreline. The others hesitated but followed her lead, setting up a small campfire. As the flames crackled, Kate pulled out a wooden spirit board. "No way," Tommy said immediately. "That's how horror movies start." "Relax," Kate replied with a grin. "It's just a game. Besides, nothing's going to happen." The group sat in a circle, placing their fingers on the planchette. The firelight danced across their faces as Kate began to speak. "If there's anyone here with us," she said in a dramatic tone, "show us a sign." At first, there was only silence. Then, the planchette moved. Slowly, deliberately, it slid across the board, spelling a single word, "Help." The teens froze. "Very funny," Ben said, his voice trembling slightly. "I'm not doing it," Jess whispered. A cold wind swept through the campsite, extinguishing the fire. In the sudden darkness, a faint glow appeared over the lake. It hovered for a moment before flickering out, leaving the group in stunned silence. "What the hell was that?" Tommy finally managed to say. Nobody had an answer. But they all felt it, the unshakable sensation that they were no longer alone. The stillness of the night deepened after the faint glow over the lake disappeared. It left an almost tangible weight in the air, as if the darkness itself had grown heavier. The teens sat frozen, the extinguished fire smoldering faintly at their feet. "Did anyone else see that?" Jess finally broke the silence, her voice barely above a whisper. "It was probably some kind of swamp gas," Ben offered, though he didn't sound convinced. His eyes darted nervously toward the lake. "Swamp gas doesn't spell words," Kate countered, her hands clutching the spirit board tightly. "Something, or someone, is out there." Tommy stood abruptly, brushing dirt off his jeans. "This isn't funny anymore, Kate. Let's pack up and leave. Now." Before anyone could respond, there was a splash. It wasn't the gentle ripple of water lapping against the shore, it was a heavy, deliberate sound, as if something large had just entered the lake. The group turned as one, their eyes straining against the darkness. The surface of the lake was impossibly calm, yet the sound had been unmistakable. "What was that?" Jess asked, her voice trembling. "Probably a fish," Ben said, though the crack in his voice betrayed his unease. "Biggest damn fish I've ever heard," Tommy muttered. Kate reached for the lantern and clicked it on. Its pale yellow beam cut through the night, casting long shadows on the trees and illuminating the edge of the lake. For a moment, there was nothing, just the still water and the reflection of the moon, faint and distorted. Then they saw it. A figure stood at the far end of the shoreline, partially obscured by the mist rising from the lake. It was humanoid but unnaturally still, its outline faint and blurred. The figure's head tilted slightly, as if it were watching them. "Oh my God," Jess gasped, grabbing Ben's arm. "Is that a person?" Tommy asked, though he didn't move any closer. Kate, despite the fear prickling at the edges of her mind, took a step forward, the lantern shaking slightly in her hand. "Hello?" she called out, her voice echoing across the water. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it began to move, not toward them, but into the lake. Its steps were slow, deliberate, and silent, leaving no ripples as it disappeared beneath the surface. "Did you see that?" Ben shouted, his panic finally breaking through. "It just walked into the freaking lake. Why wasn't there any splash?" Jess whispered, her nails digging into Ben's arm. Kate turned back to the group, her face pale but determined. "We can't just leave. Whatever that was, it's connected to this place. To the stories. Stories don't kill people." Tommy snapped. "But that thing might." As they argued, a low, guttural sound echoed from the woods behind them. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't human. It was something else entirely. The group fell silent, their breaths shallow as the sound grew louder, closer. It was accompanied by the faint rustling of leaves, though there was no wind. "Run," Kate whispered. Without another word, they bolted, abandoning their campsite and sprinting down the narrow path that led back to the car. The sound followed them, growing louder with every step, until it felt like it was right behind them. When they finally reached the car, Tommy fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking uncontrollably. He dropped them twice before finally getting the door unlocked. They piled in, slamming the doors shut as Tommy started the engine. The headlights flickered on, illuminating the path ahead. For a brief moment, they caught a glimpse of something standing at the edge of the woods. It wasn't the same figure they had seen by the lake. This one was taller, darker, and its eyes glowed a deep, menacing red. Tommy hit the gas, and the car lurched forward, leaving the creature, and the horrors of Blackwood Lake, behind. Or so they thought. The car sped down the dirt road, its headlights cutting through the suffocating darkness of the forest. Inside, the group sat in tense silence, their breaths shallow and hearts racing. The eerie sound that had chased them still echoed in their minds, a guttural growl that didn't belong to any creature they knew. "Tommy, drive faster." Jess snapped, her voice trembling. She sat in the back seat, her hands gripping the door handle as if she might leap out at any moment. "I'm going as fast as I can." Tommy shot back, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. The road was narrow and riddled with potholes, making every turn feel treacherous. Ben, seated next to Jess, kept glancing out the rear window. "It's following us," he muttered, his voice barely audible. "What are you talking about?" Kate asked from the front passenger seat, her head snapping toward him. "I saw it," Ben insisted, his eyes wide with fear. "Back there, in the trees. It's keeping up with us." "Don't be ridiculous," Kate said, though her voice lacked its usual confidence. She turned to look out the side window, scanning the dense forest for any sign of movement. For a moment, it seemed like they might have escaped. The woods thinned, and the dirt road transitioned into smooth asphalt. The lights of Pine Creek flickered in the distance, a beacon of safety. Then, the car's engine sputtered. "No, no, no!" Tommy shouted, slamming his hand against the steering wheel as the vehicle began to slow. "What's happening?" Jess cried, panic rising in her voice. "I don't know. It's just stopping." Tommy pulled the car to the side of the road as it gave one last wheeze and died completely. The headlights dimmed, leaving them in near total darkness. "Great," Ben muttered, his tone edged with hysteria. "We're sitting ducks out here." "Calm down," Kate said, though her own fear was evident. She turned to Tommy. "Can you fix it? Do I look like a mechanic?" Tommy snapped, popping the hood anyway. He stepped out, the sound of the door slamming echoing unnaturally loud in the quiet night. Kate followed, holding the lantern. "Stay close," she whispered, lighting the lantern and casting a pale glow over the engine. Inside the car, Jess and Ben sat frozen, their eyes darting between the windows. "Do you hear that?" Jess asked suddenly. Ben strained his ears. At first, there was nothing but the faint hum of crickets. Then he heard it, a soft, rhythmic tapping. "It's probably just a branch," he said, though his voice wavered. "No, it's closer," Jess insisted, her voice dropping to a whisper. The tapping grew louder, more deliberate, like fingernails rapping against the metal of the car. It came from the roof. Outside, Tommy cursed under his breath. "I have no idea what's wrong. It's like the car just..." A loud thud interrupted him, coming from the roof of the car. "What the hell was that?" Kate hissed, clutching the lantern tighter. Tommy stepped back, staring at the car as if it might attack him. The tapping stopped, replaced by a low, guttural growl, the same one they'd heard in the woods. "Get back inside," Kate whispered, her voice trembling. Before they could move, something slid off the roof and landed in front of them. It was the figure from the lake, its form now clearer in the lantern's glow. It was humanoid but grotesquely elongated, with skin that glistened like wet stone. Its eyes were black voids, and its mouth twisted into an unnatural grin. Tommy and Kate froze as the creature tilted its head, studying them with eerie curiosity. Then, with impossible speed, it lunged. Tommy barely had time to react as the creature lunged at him. Instinctively, he dove to the side, crashing into the gravel shoulder of the road. Kate screamed, dropping the lantern, which shattered on impact, plunging the area into darkness once more. Inside the car, Jess and Ben watched in horror as the creature loomed over Kate, its elongated limbs twisting unnaturally. It didn't make a sound, but its presence was suffocating, an oppressive weight that pressed against their chests. "Tommy!" Kate cried, scrambling backward as the thing advanced. Tommy grabbed a wrench from the toolbox he had left on the ground earlier. With a shout, he swung it at the creature, connecting with a sickening crunch. The thing staggered but didn't fall. Instead, it turned its eyeless gaze toward him, as if it had just noticed his existence. "Run!" Tommy yelled at Kate, raising the wrench again. She didn't need to be told twice. Scrambling to her feet, Kate sprinted toward the car. Jess flung the door open, and Kate dove inside, slamming it shut behind her. "Where's Tommy?" Ben asked, his voice high with panic. Kate didn't answer. She stared out the window, her breath fogging the glass as she watched Tommy square off with the creature. Come on," she whispered, willing him to move. Tommy swung the wrench again, but this time the creature caught it midair. Its long, spindly fingers wrapped around the metal, twisting it with inhuman strength. The wrench snapped in half, and Tommy stumbled backward, his bravado evaporating. The creature lunged again, but Tommy was quicker this time. He ducked, rolling away and sprinting toward the car. "Open the door," he shouted, his voice breaking with desperation. Ben fumbled with the lock, his hands shaking uncontrollably. Finally, the door flew open, and Tommy threw himself inside just as the creature slammed against the car. The impact rocked the vehicle, and the windows rattled violently. Jess screamed, pressing herself against Ben as the creature clawed at the roof, its nails screeching against the metal. "Start the car!" Kate yelled. "It won't start." Tommy shouted back, his voice thick with frustration and fear. The creature's weight shifted, and the car tilted slightly as it climbed onto the roof. The group could hear its movements, the sickening scrape of its limbs against the metal. "What does it want?" Jess sobbed, tears streaming down her face. Kate's mind raced. The spirit board's message flashed in her memory, "Help. It's not just trying to kill us," she said aloud, her voice trembling. "It's connected to the lake. To whatever's trapped there." "Great, so what do we do?" "Ask it nicely to stop." Ben snapped, his voice cracking. Suddenly, the growling stopped. The creature's movement ceased, and an eerie silence enveloped the car. "What's happening?" Tommy whispered. Kate turned to look out the window. Through the darkness, she saw them, more figures emerging from the forest. They moved slowly, their forms ghostly and translucent, like shadows given shape. Unlike the creature on the roof, these beings radiated a sorrowful energy, their faces contorted in expressions of anguish. The creature hissed, a guttural, angry sound, and leapt off the car. It turned to face the spectral figures, its body crouched in a defensive posture. "They're fighting it," Kate realized, her voice barely audible. The ghostly figures advanced on the creature, their forms flickering like candle flames in the wind. The thing snarled and swiped at them, but its attacks seemed to pass through them harmlessly. "We need to get out of here," Tommy said, his hands trembling as he gripped the steering wheel, even though the car was dead. Kate nodded. "We're not safe yet." As the spectral figures closed in on the creature, the group knew this was their only chance. The spectral figures surrounded the creature, their ghostly forms shimmering like pale smoke against the dark forest backdrop. The thing on the road let out an ear-splitting shriek, a sound so unnatural it sent shivers through the teens, even inside the car. "Now's our chance," Kate urged, shaking Tommy's shoulder. "The car's dead." Tommy shot back, his voice raw with frustration. "Then we run," Jess cried, her trembling hand on the door handle. "Are you insane?" Ben exclaimed. "We'll never outrun that thing." Kate wasn't listening. She leaned over, pulling her backpack from the floor. Inside, she found what she was looking for, the spirit board. She glanced out the window. The spectral figures were still holding the creature at bay, though its thrashing was growing more violent by the second. "Kate, what the hell are you doing?" Tommy demanded as she opened the car door. "We're connected to this somehow," she shouted over her shoulder. "If we don't help them, it won't stop coming after us." "Kate, no!" Jess screamed, but Kate was already outside, clutching the spirit board tightly. The cold night air hit her like a wall, but she pushed forward, her eyes locked on the chaotic scene ahead. She stopped a few feet away from the car, placing the spirit board on the ground. "If you can hear me," she called out, her voice shaking, "tell me what you want. How do we stop this?" The board was still for a moment. Then the planchette jerked violently, moving on its own. Kate knelt down, her eyes wide as it spelled out a single word. "Lake." The creature let out another piercing shriek, its form twisting unnaturally as it broke free from the spectral figure's grip. It turned its eyeless face toward Kate, its body crouched as if preparing to pounce. "Kate, get back in the car!" Tommy shouted, throwing open the door. But Kate didn't move. Her fear was overridden by a strange sense of clarity. "The lake," she murmured. "It wants us to go to the lake." "What?" Ben yelled, sticking his head out the window. "Why would we go closer to that place?" Before Kate could respond, the ghostly figures reappeared, placing themselves between her and the creature. One of them, a tall, sorrowful-looking man, raised a translucent hand and pointed toward the lake. "We have to go," Kate said firmly, standing and grabbing the spirit board. Tommy hesitated for a split second before slamming the hood shut. Fine. But how are we supposed to get there if the car's dead? As if in response, the spectral man floated toward the car, his hand brushing over the hood. The headlights flickered on, and the engine roared to life. I'm not questioning it, Tommy muttered, jumping into the driver's seat. Kate scrambled back into the car, slamming the door as the creature lunged at them. The spectral figures intercepted it, holding it back long enough for Tommy to floor the gas pedal. The car surged forward, tires screeching as they sped down the road toward the lake. Inside, the tension was palpable. Jess sat curled in the back seat, tears streaming down her face. Ben clutched the dashboard, his face pale and drawn. This is insane, he muttered. We're driving straight into the nightmare. We don't have a choice, Kate said, her voice steady despite the chaos. This is the only way to end it. As the car raced toward the lake, the shadows of the trees seemed to stretch longer, their shapes twisting like grasping hands. The guttural growls of the creature echoed faintly behind them, a haunting reminder that they weren't out of danger yet. When the dark waters of Blackwood Lake came into view, an overwhelming sense of dread washed over them. The lake looked more menacing than ever, its surface shimmering unnaturally under the pale moonlight. Tommy slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a stop near the shoreline. Now what? Jess asked, her voice trembling. Kate didn't answer. She stepped out of the car, the spirit board in her hands, and began walking toward the lake. Kate's feet crunched against the gravel as she approached the lake's edge. The cold air was heavier here, almost suffocating, and the surface of the water rippled unnaturally despite the absence of wind. Kate, stop! Tommy shouted, stepping out of the car. He ran after her, his voice strained with both fear and frustration. You can't just walk into that thing. I don't think we have a choice, Kate replied, not stopping. Her grip on the spirit board tightened as she stared at the water, its surface reflecting fragmented glimpses of the moon and stars. Jess and Ben climbed out of the car, their reluctance evident in their slow movements. This is a terrible idea, Jess muttered, wrapping her arms around herself. Yeah, but staying in the car didn't exactly feel safe either, Ben said, though his attempt at humor fell flat. Tommy caught up to Kate, grabbing her arm. If you're going to do this, at least tell me the plan. Kate turned to face him, her green eyes glowing with determination. I think the lake is the key to all of this. The board said lake. The spirits pointed us here. Whatever's been happening, it started here, and it has to end here. That thing is still out there. Tommy argued. I know, Kate said softly. But those spirits are trying to help us. They're keeping it at bay, giving us time to figure this out. The rest of the group gathered at the shoreline, their breaths visible in the freezing air. Okay, Jess said shakily, let's say you're right. What do we do now? Just stand here and hope for the best. Kate knelt on the cold, damp ground and placed the spirit board on the earth beside her. She touched the planchette with trembling fingers. If you can hear me, she whispered, tell me what to do. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the planchette began to move, slowly and deliberately, spelling out a single phrase. Return the pieces. What does that mean? Ben asked, his voice breaking the tense silence. Kate looked up, her mind racing. I think it's talking about the lake. There's something in there, something that was broken or taken. We need to bring it back. Jess shook her head. You can't be serious. We're not diving into that lake. A low growl rumbled in the distance, and the group turned in unison. Emerging from the forest was the creature, its elongated limbs glistening under the moonlight. Behind it, the spectral figures flickered weakly, their energy seemingly drained from holding it back. We don't have time to argue, Kate said, standing. We need to act now. Tommy looked at the water, then back at the advancing creature. His jaw tightened. If we're doing this, we're doing it together. Without waiting for a response, he waded into the lake, the icy water soaking his jeans. Kate followed, clutching the spirit board. Jess and Ben hesitated, glancing nervously between the lake and the approaching monster. "Jess, come on!" Tommy shouted, already waist-deep in the water. Jess let out a shaky breath and stepped into the lake, the cold stealing the air from her lungs. Ben cursed under his breath but followed, his flashlight trembling in his hands. The water grew deeper with each step, and the group struggled against the chill that numbed their bodies. When they were chest-deep, Kate stopped. "Here," she said, her voice barely audible. The water around them rippled violently, and a deep, guttural sound echoed from beneath the surface. "What was that?" Ben shouted, his panic rising. Kate didn't answer. She held the spirit board aloft, her hands shaking. "If this is what you want," she said, "take it." The water surged, forming a vortex that pulled at their legs. Kate felt the board jerk in her hands, as if an unseen force was trying to take it. "Let it go!" Tommy yelled. Kate released the board, and it was immediately sucked into the swirling depths. The vortex grew stronger, and the group struggled to stay afloat. Above the surface, the creature let out a piercing scream. Its form twisted and contorted, as if it were being dragged toward the lake. "It's working!" Jess cried, clinging to Ben for support. The spectral figures appeared on the shoreline, their forms glowing brighter as they advanced. One by one, they stepped into the lake, their energy merging with the vortex. The creature let out one final, ear-splitting shriek before its body was pulled into the water. The vortex calmed, and the surface of the lake became eerily still. For a moment, the group floated in silence, their breaths heavy and uneven. Then, the water began to glow, a soft, warm light that spread outward, illuminating the entire lake. The spectral figures stood in the shallows, their faces now peaceful. One by one, they turned to the group and nodded before fading into the light. "It's over," Kate whispered, her voice breaking. But deep down, she wasn't sure if she believed it. The group stood in the shallows of Blackwood Lake, their bodies trembling from the icy water and adrenaline. The eerie glow that had spread across the lake began to fade, leaving only the pale moonlight reflecting on its surface. For a moment, everything was still. "Is it really over?" Jess whispered, her voice shaky. Tommy didn't answer right away. He scanned the water, his fists clenched and his jaw tight. "It better be," he muttered, his eyes darting toward the tree line where the creature had first emerged. Kate stared at the spot where the spirit board had vanished, her mind racing. The message, "Return the pieces," still echoed in her head. Had they truly done what the spirits wanted? "I think the lake took it," she said softly, turning to face the others. "Whatever that thing was, it's gone now." "Gone where?" Ben asked, his tone sharp. "Because if it's not dead, we just made it someone else's problem." "Does it matter?" Jess shot back, her voice trembling. "We're alive. That's what matters." Tommy exhaled heavily, running a hand through his wet hair. "Let's get out of here. We need to get warm before we all freeze to death." The group trudged back to the car, their soaked clothes clinging to their skin and their movements sluggish. The oppressive weight that had hung in the air all night seemed to have lifted, but none of them felt safe yet. Tommy slid into the driver's seat, turning the key. The engine roared to life, and a collective sigh of relief passed through the car. "Thank God," Jess muttered, sinking into her seat. As they drove away from the lake, the group remained silent, their thoughts too tangled to put into words. The road stretched endlessly ahead, the forest closing in around them like a living tunnel. Kate couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. She stared out the window, her gaze fixed on the trees. The shadows seemed darker now, more menacing, and she swore she saw movement out of the corner of her eye. "Do you feel that?" she asked suddenly, breaking the silence. Feel what? Tommy replied, his eyes fixed on the road. The air, Kate said, her voice barely above a whisper. It's heavier. Jess shivered. Don't start, Kate. Please. I'm serious, Kate insisted. Something's wrong. Before anyone could respond, the car jerked violently, as if something had hit it. Jesus! Tommy shouted, slamming on the brakes. The car skidded to a stop, the headlights cutting through the darkness. The group sat frozen, their hearts pounding. What was that? Ben asked, his voice barely audible. I don't know, Tommy said, gripping the steering wheel tightly. He peered out the windshield, but the road ahead was empty. Kate reached for the door handle. We need to check. Don't, Jess interrupted, grabbing her arm. What if it's still out there? Kate hesitated, her hand hovering over the door handle. She glanced at Tommy, who gave her a reluctant nod. Stay here, he said. I'll look. Are you crazy? Ben exclaimed. You're not going out there alone. Tommy ignored him, stepping out of the car with a flashlight in hand. The beam cut through the night, revealing nothing but the empty road and the looming trees. He circled the car, his breath visible in the frigid air. Just as he was about to head back inside, he heard it, a soft, rhythmic tapping. Tommy, hurry up. Jess called from inside the car. The tapping grew louder, more deliberate. It was coming from behind him. Tommy turned slowly, the flashlight trembling in his hand. His heart sank as he saw it, deep in the woods, two black, empty eyes staring back at him. It wasn't over. Tommy froze, his breath hitching as those empty eyes bore into him from the depths of the forest. The creature's twisted form emerged slowly, its elongated limbs moving with an unnatural grace. It didn't growl or shriek this time, it simply stood there, watching. Tommy. Kate's voice cut through the heavy silence, snapping him out of his trance. He turned on his heel and bolted back to the car, his heart hammering in his chest. The flashlight slipped from his grasp, clattering onto the road behind him. Start the car. Tommy yelled as he threw himself into the driver's seat, slamming the door shut. What's happening? Jess cried, her voice rising in panic. It's back, Tommy panted, fumbling with the gearshift. No way, Ben muttered, peering out the window. But his bravado faded instantly when he saw the dark silhouette stepping onto the road. Oh, my God. It's real. It's really real. Go, go, go. Jess screamed, clutching Ben's arm. Tommy floored the gas pedal, and the car lurched forward. The tires screeched against the pavement as they sped away, but the creature didn't give chase. Instead, it stood motionless, its head tilting slightly as it watched them disappear into the darkness. Inside the car, the tension was suffocating. No one spoke, the only sound the hum of the engine and their ragged breaths. What do we do now? Jess finally asked, her voice trembling. Kate stared straight ahead, her knuckles white as she gripped the dashboard. The lake didn't work, she said quietly. We missed something. What else could there be? Ben snapped. We gave it the damn board. We almost died out there. It said, return the pieces, Kate said, her voice more resolute now. The board was just part of it. There's something else, something still broken. Tommy shook his head. Kate, no offense, but we're out of options. That thing's not playing by any rules we understand. Kate turned to him, her green eyes blazing. That's exactly why we can't just run. It's tied to us now, Tommy. To the lake, to that spirit board, everything. If we don't fix this, it'll keep coming, no matter where we go. Tommy's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. What about the stories? Jess asked suddenly, her voice quiet. The ones about the lake. Didn't they say something about a family or a girl? Kate's breath caught. The Blackwood family, she murmured. They owned the land before the town was built. Their daughter, she drowned in the lake. Ben frowned. And you think this thing is her? That doesn't make sense. Maybe it's not her, Kate said, her mind racing. Maybe it's something else. Something connected to her. Like what? Jess asked, dread creeping into her voice. Before Kate could answer, the car shuddered violently, and the engine sputtered. No, 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 Tommy muttered, hitting the steering wheel as the car began to slow. The dashboard lights flickered, and the engine died completely. Why now? Jess wailed, looking around frantically. The silence that followed was deafening. The group sat frozen, listening to the faint sounds of the forest. Then, from the darkness behind them, came the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate and impossibly heavy. It's here, Ben whispered, his face pale. Kate's hand moved instinctively to the door handle. We can't stay in the car. It's too exposed. Are you insane? Jess hissed. Do you have a better idea? Kate shot back. The footsteps grew louder, closer. The group exchanged terrified glances before Tommy nodded grimly. Let's move. Stay together, no matter what. They stepped out of the car, their breaths visible in the icy air. The forest seemed alive around them, the shadows shifting and whispering. Where do we go? Jess asked, clutching Ben's arm. Kate pointed toward a faint path leading deeper into the woods. There. It'll take us back to the lake. Ben groaned. Back to the lake? Are you kidding me? It's the only way, Kate said firmly. The group moved quickly, their footsteps crunching against the frozen ground. Behind them, the footsteps followed, steady and unrelenting. Every instinct told them to run, but they knew it wouldn't help. The creature was toying with them, dragging out the chase. As the trees thinned and the glimmering surface of Blackwood Lake came into view again, Kate felt a surge of determination. Whatever was broken, whatever needed to be returned, she would find it. And she would end this, once and for all. The group arrived at the lake's edge, their breath coming in short, panicked bursts. The oppressive silence of the woods seemed to deepen around them, pressing in from every direction. The water shimmered under the pale moonlight, but it was no longer a tranquil sight. The lake was alive, swirling with an unnatural energy that pulsed beneath the surface. Why are we back here? Ben whispered, his voice strained with fear. We need to get out of here, now. Kate stood motionless, staring at the water. We're not leaving until we find out what's really going on. Tommy, his face drawn with exhaustion and fear, walked over to Kate and placed a hand on her shoulder. Kate, we don't even know what we're looking for. This place is cursed. We've been here for hours, and all we've done is run in circles. Kate didn't look at him. Instead, she glanced down at the ground, where she saw a small, delicate object half buried in the wet earth. She crouched down to examine it. Kate. Tommy's voice was full of concern now. Kate's fingers brushed the object, and she gasped. It was an old, faded photograph, torn along one edge, the corners curling with age. In the picture, a young girl stood by the water's edge, smiling as if she knew nothing of the horror that had already begun to take root here. This is the girl, Kate said softly, holding up the photograph. The one who drowned. Jess stepped closer, squinting at the image. You think this is her? The Blackwood girl? Kate nodded slowly, her heart heavy with the weight of realization. She must have been the key, the piece that was missing. The one that was broken, Ben added, his voice trembling. Kate turned back to the lake, the photograph still clutched in her hand. She could feel the weight of its significance, the girl's spirit, her pain, her sorrow, all of it was still here, tied to the lake. "We need to find out more about her," Kate said, her eyes narrowing. "What happened to her, why she drowned, and how it all connects to this thing that's been hunting us." "Are you serious?" Jess exclaimed, looking at the lake with terror in her eyes. "You want to stay here and dig up whatever dark secret is buried in this cursed place?" "We have no choice," Kate replied. "We've already brought the creature back by meddling with the spirit board. If we don't fix what happened to her, it'll never stop." Tommy glanced at the water uneasily. "If this is really the Blackwood girl, she's been dead for years. How are we supposed to fix something that's been broken for so long?" Kate didn't answer. Instead, she looked at the photograph again and noticed something strange. In the background of the image, there was a shape, faint, almost invisible, but unmistakably there. A figure, standing in the distance, watching the girl. "That's not normal," she muttered, pointing at the figure in the background. "Who's that?" Ben squinted at the photograph. "I don't know. But it looks like someone is watching her." "Someone?" Jess repeated, her voice trembling. "What if it's the thing that's been after us?" Kate felt a chill run through her. "I think it is." Suddenly, the air around them grew colder, the temperature dropping as though the world itself was holding its breath. The surface of the lake rippled violently, and the creature appeared at the water's edge. Its pale eyes glowed eerily in the moonlight, fixed on them with an unnatural hunger. "It's here," Tommy whispered, his voice cracking. "It's coming for us." Kate's mind raced. The creature's presence was growing stronger. She could feel it, deep in her bones. It wasn't just a monster anymore. It was a manifestation of something far darker, something tied to the lake, the Blackwood family, and the girl. "We have to finish this," Kate said, turning to the others. "We have to figure out who that figure is in the photo and what it means. It's the only way we can stop this." Ben shook his head, his eyes wide with fear. "What if we don't? What if this is bigger than we can handle?" Kate didn't respond. She didn't have the answers. But she did have one thing, determination. The creature was almost upon them, its monstrous form moving with unnatural speed. The ground beneath their feet trembled, and the very air seemed to vibrate with its presence. "We don't have much time," Kate said. "We need to find the truth. Now." As the creature lunged, the group scattered, the sound of its growl echoing through the trees. Kate, her heart pounding in her chest, sprinted toward the old Blackwood cabin. She had to find something, anything, that would give her the answers they needed. As the others followed, the creature's growl grew louder, filling the night with a sense of dread that seemed to stretch into eternity. The lake was calling, and they had no choice but to answer. The Blackwood cabin loomed ahead like a dark specter in the night, its crooked structure barely visible through the thick mist that had rolled in from the lake. The trees around it were twisted and gnarled, their limbs reaching out like skeletal hands, as if trying to keep the world away. Kate's heart pounded in her chest as she ran toward the cabin, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The others were right behind her, though they seemed hesitant, unsure if this was the right place to confront whatever horror had been unleashed. "Kate, wait." Tommy's voice broke through the sound of her racing footsteps. She turned to see him struggling to keep up, his face pale, his breath clouding in the freezing air. "We can't stop now," Kate said, her voice tight with urgency. "We're running out of time. The creature, it's getting closer." Tommy nodded grimly, but there was fear in his eyes. What if this place is part of the curse? Kate didn't have an answer for him. She could feel it, too. The place seemed alive, breathing in time with the wind, and the weight of its history pressed down on her like a physical force. But there was no other choice. The answers were here, and she had to find them. As they approached the cabin, the door creaked open on its own, as if inviting them inside. The air around them was thick with the scent of decay and damp wood, and the silence was suffocating. "I don't like this," Ben muttered, looking over his shoulder. "This place feels wrong." "Stay close," Kate said, her voice barely above a whisper. She stepped inside the cabin, and the others reluctantly followed. The interior was dark, save for a faint light coming from the far corner where an old, tattered lantern flickered weakly. The floorboards creaked under their weight as they moved deeper into the room, the dust thick on every surface, as if the cabin hadn't been touched in years. "What are we looking for?" Jess asked, her voice shaking. "What's supposed to be here?" Kate's eyes scanned the room, taking in every detail. There were old photographs on the walls, most of them too faded to make out clearly. But one caught her eye, a portrait of a young girl standing by the lake, her face serene, though her eyes seemed to hold a depth of sorrow. "That's her," Kate said quietly, pointing at the portrait. "The Blackwood girl?" Tommy asked. "Yes," Kate said. "This is where it all started. This cabin, her family." The group gathered around the portrait, their fear giving way to curiosity. Kate's eyes narrowed as she studied the painting more closely. Beneath the girl's feet, partially hidden in the shadows, was the same faint figure from the photograph they'd found earlier. The one that had been watching the girl. "Who is that?" Jess asked, pointing at the shadowy figure. Kate's breath caught in her throat. "It's him. The man from the story." "What story?" Ben asked, his voice tight with dread. Kate turned to face him. The Blackwood family was known for its wealth, but there was a darkness surrounding them. The father, Thomas Blackwood, was rumored to have dabbled in dark rituals, things that were better left untouched. The girl, her name was Eliza, she was part of that. Jess recoiled. "A sacrifice?" Kate nodded grimly. "Yes. Eliza drowned in the lake, though no one could ever explain how. Some say it was an accident, but others say it was a ritual gone wrong. But why would the creature be tied to her?" Tommy asked, his voice filled with confusion. Kate pointed at the shadowy figure in the portrait again. "I think that's her father. He was part of whatever dark magic was happening here. When Eliza died, something was broken, something the lake couldn't contain." Ben shivered. "So what, the monster's some kind of leftover curse?" Kate shook her head. "It's not just a curse. It's a part of Eliza's story, her family's story. They didn't finish whatever they started, and now it's coming after us." The lantern flickered, casting long shadows across the room. For a moment, the group stood in silence, processing what Kate had just revealed. Then, the door slammed shut behind them, and the room seemed to darken even further. "We're not alone," Jess whispered. The floor beneath their feet groaned as something moved in the shadows. "Get ready," Kate said, her voice low. "Whatever this is, it's not finished yet." From the corner of the cabin, a low, guttural growl echoed, and the air grew thick with the stench of rot. Slowly, the creature emerged from the darkness, its pale, glowing eyes fixed on them. Its body twisted in ways that defied nature, and its form seemed to flicker in and out of existence, like a mirage. "This is it," Kate said, stepping forward, her heart pounding. "This is what we have to stop." As the creature advanced, the group instinctively backed away, but there was nowhere to run. The walls of the cabin seemed to close in around them, trapping them in the center of the nightmare they had unleashed. "We have to finish what they started," Kate whispered, her voice steady despite the terror rising inside her. "We have to return what was broken." And with that, she stepped toward the creature, ready to face whatever lay ahead. The creature's growl reverberated through the cabin, its twisted form shifting and warping, as if it were made of shadows themselves. The air grew thick with an overwhelming sense of dread, and the temperature dropped sharply. It was no longer just a monster from their nightmares, it was something ancient, something that had been waiting for them, patiently. Kate's heart hammered in her chest, but she didn't flinch. Her eyes never left the creature, and her grip tightened around the photograph of Eliza. This was the moment. Everything had led to this. "We can't fight it with force," Tommy said, his voice hoarse. He stood beside Kate, looking at the creature with a mixture of terror and determination. "We have to end this with knowledge, somehow." Kate nodded, her mind racing. "Return the pieces." The words from the spirit board echoed in her mind. But return what? What were the pieces they had missed? Suddenly, she remembered something that had been nagging at her since they found the photograph. The figure in the background. The man. Thomas Blackwood. "That's it," Kate whispered, a sense of clarity washing over her. "What?" Ben asked, his voice sharp with panic. "What's it?" "The man in the photograph," Kate explained, her eyes widening. "It's him. The one who caused all this. The piece we're missing is his part in the ritual. He was the one who bound Eliza to the lake with whatever dark magic he was using. We have to find him." "How do we find him?" Jess asked. She was shaking, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear. "I don't know," Kate said, staring at the creature, which had now stopped advancing. It seemed to be watching them, almost waiting for something. "But it's here. In this cabin. We need to look deeper." With a shaky breath, Kate stepped toward the far wall of the cabin, where a large, weathered bookcase loomed. The dusty shelves were filled with old, leather-bound books, each one older than the last. She felt drawn to them, like the books themselves were whispering to her. "Help me look," she said urgently, turning to the others. Ben and Tommy immediately started rifling through the books, while Jess lingered by the door, her eyes darting nervously between the shelves and the creature. But she didn't speak, she was too frightened. As Kate pulled a thick, tattered volume from the shelf, she could feel its weight in her hands. The cover was blank, save for a strange symbol carved into the leather. She ran her fingers over it, shivers crawling up her spine. This was it, this was the source of everything. Kate opened the book, the pages brittle and yellowed with age. The words were written in a language she didn't recognize, but the illustrations were unmistakable. There were drawings of the Blackwood family, Thomas Blackwood and his daughter, Eliza, along with cryptic symbols and strange rituals. Her fingers trembled as she turned the pages, but then she froze. One drawing caught her eye. It depicted a dark ritual by the lake, with Thomas Blackwood standing at the center, his arms raised toward the moon. At his feet lay the body of a young girl, Eliza. And surrounding them were symbols, runes, etched into the ground in a circle. "Kate." Tommy's voice interrupted her thoughts. He had found something too. She turned toward him, and her eyes widened when she saw the parchment he was holding. It was a letter written by Thomas Blackwood himself. "This is it," Tommy said, his voice grim. "It explains the ritual. What he did to Eliza." Kate rushed over, her heart racing. She quickly read the letter, her eyes widening with horror. "Thomas Blackwood was trying to bring his daughter back," Kate whispered, her voice shaking. "But it went wrong. He bound her soul to the lake, and in doing so, created the creature. A twisted version of Eliza, a reflection of her pain, her rage. But how do we stop it?" Jess asked, her voice trembling. "How do we break the bond?" Kate stared at the page, the answer staring her in the face. The ritual wasn't just about binding a soul. It was about sacrifice. Eliza's spirit had been trapped in the lake, and only by offering another life could the curse be lifted. "There's one more part to the ritual," Kate said slowly, her voice barely audible. "Thomas Blackwood didn't just tie Eliza to the lake. He tied himself to her as well. He was a part of the sacrifice. The realization hit like a bolt of lightning. The creature wasn't just some external entity. It was a product of Thomas's dark magic. The only way to end it was to return the balance. "We have to break the bond," Kate said firmly, her gaze locked on the creature. "To do that, we need to bring Thomas Blackwood back to the lake." "What?" Ben asked, confusion and fear in his voice. "How do we bring him back?" "We don't bring him back," Kate replied. "We return what was taken. Eliza's soul. It's the only way to sever the link between them and end the creature." As if on cue, the creature's growl grew louder, and it stepped closer, its eyes glowing with malevolent energy. The room seemed to close in around them, the walls constricting as the air grew heavier. "Kate," Tommy began, but Kate cut him off, determination flooding her veins. "We do this now," she said firmly. "We finish it. We return what was broken." With that, she turned toward the door, knowing there was no turning back. The creature would not wait, and neither could they. They had one chance. The creature's growl reverberated through the cabin like a sickeningly deep rumble of thunder. It was closer now, too close. Kate could feel its presence pressing in on her, a suffocating weight in the air. The others were just behind her, their faces pale with fear, but there was no turning back now. Kate stepped out into the night, the cold air biting at her skin. The lake lay in front of her, its surface black and still. A twisted silence hung over everything, as if the world itself was holding its breath. She turned to face the others. "This is it," she said, her voice steady but her heart racing. "We have to get to the lake. The ritual, everything, is tied to this place." Tommy stepped forward, his hands trembling. "But how do we finish it? We don't know the full ritual, we don't even know what it'll take to break it." Kate met his gaze, her expression hard. "We know enough. The only way to end this is to return the soul. We have to take Eliza's spirit back to the lake. Only then can the creature be destroyed." Ben swallowed hard, his eyes darting nervously between Kate and the lake. "But if we do this, if we try, what happens to the creature?" "We end it," Kate said, though her voice betrayed a hint of uncertainty. "The bond will break. The creature will die." Kate wasn't entirely sure of that. But she couldn't show doubt now. They had come this far. They had no choice but to face the darkness. The group moved toward the water's edge, each step heavy with dread. The trees loomed over them, the shadows seeming to grow longer, more oppressive as they approached the lake. In the distance, the creature's growl rumbled again, echoing in the empty space around them. Then they reached the shore. The black water stretched endlessly before them, and for a moment, everything was still. Too still. The surface of the lake was calm, almost unnatural in its stillness. "I don't like this," Jess muttered, her voice breaking the silence. Kate nodded, her thoughts swirling. "We need to summon her," she said, though the words felt hollow. "We need to call Eliza's spirit. It's the only way to return what was broken." Ben glanced around uneasily. "And how exactly are we supposed to do that?" Kate's eyes were fixed on the water. "We don't have the full ritual, but we know one thing for sure. Eliza's spirit is still here, still bound to the lake. We have to bring her to the surface. We'll call out to her." The others exchanged uneasy glances, but they nodded in agreement. Kate closed her eyes, taking a deep breath, focusing on the image of Eliza, the girl from the photograph, the spirit bound to this cursed lake. She could feel the weight of her presence, something tugging at her from the depths. "Eliza," Kate called softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "We're here to help you. We're here to return what was taken. Come back. Come back to the surface." The wind picked up, swirling around them in a low, almost mournful hum. The lake rippled, though there was no sign of movement beneath the surface. Kate's heart thudded in her chest. And then it happened. The water began to churn violently, as if something was rising from the depths. The air grew thick with a sense of dread, and the sky above seemed to darken, clouds swirling in unnatural patterns. The creature's growl came again, louder this time, as if it were in agony. "Kate!" Tommy shouted. "What's happening?" Kate didn't answer. She was focused on the water, her eyes wide with disbelief. The surface of the lake had broken open, and from the darkness below, a figure emerged. It was a girl. The girl from the photograph. Eliza Blackwood. But she was no longer the smiling child of the picture. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow and empty, and her body seemed to float just above the water, as if she were suspended between worlds. She was a specter, her form flickering as though she were caught in a never-ending struggle. "Come to me," Kate whispered, her voice trembling but filled with conviction. "You're free. We're here to help you." For a moment, Eliza's gaze locked with Kate's. And then the creature appeared, emerging from the water like a nightmare made flesh, its glowing eyes fixed on them. It was no longer a mere shadow, it was the manifestation of Eliza's grief, her rage, her pain. "This is it," Kate whispered, stepping toward the water. "This is where it ends." The creature lunged, but before it could reach them, Eliza's ghostly form began to glow. The lake trembled beneath them, and the creature froze, as if held in place by an unseen force. Eliza's spirit rose from the water, her eyes now filled with a quiet sadness. "You can go now," Kate said softly. "You're free." Eliza's form shimmered, and the air around them crackled with energy. For a brief moment, the creature shrieked, its monstrous form flickering between the worlds, trying to hold on. But it was too late. The bond was broken. With one final, ear-splitting howl, the creature disintegrated, dissolving into the night like smoke in the wind. The water grew still once more. The oppressive silence lifted, replaced by the sound of the breeze rustling through the trees. Kate stood motionless, watching as Eliza's spirit faded into the night. The girl's face softened, her eyes no longer filled with sorrow. She was at peace now. The others were silent, their eyes wide in shock. "We did it," Tommy said quietly, his voice filled with disbelief. Kate nodded, her heart still racing, but a sense of relief washing over her. "It's over. The curse was broken. And the Blackwood legacy had finally been laid to rest." The silence that followed was unlike anything Kate had ever felt. The air around them was no longer thick with dread or tension, but with a peaceful stillness that seemed to settle over the lake like a blanket. The creature was gone, and with it, the darkness that had plagued them for so long. Kate turned to face the others, their eyes wide, their faces pale from the horror they had just witnessed. Ben looked like he'd aged years in the span of a few moments, his shoulders slumped with exhaustion. Jess was trembling, her eyes distant, as though she was still processing everything that had happened. And Tommy. Tommy was staring at the spot where the creature had disappeared, his expression a mixture of awe and disbelief. We did it," Ben whispered, his voice hoarse. Kate didn't reply immediately. She was still trying to process the enormity of what had just transpired. The Blackwood Curse was finally over. But at what cost? The lake, once dark and oppressive, now gleamed under the moonlight. The surface was calm, the ripples from the creature's departure fading slowly. But there was something about it that made Kate feel unsettled. "Eliza is free now," she said softly, more to herself than to anyone else. "She's at peace." Jess nodded, but her voice was shaky. "And the creature, is it really gone? I mean, for good?" Kate glanced toward the water again, her thoughts still clouded by doubt. "I think so," she said, though she wasn't entirely sure. The bond had been broken, but she couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to the lake story, something they still didn't understand. Tommy stepped forward, his gaze fixed on the water as well. "I think we all need to leave," he said, his voice firm. "This place, it's done with us. We've done all we can. It's time to go home." Kate nodded, though part of her resisted. She felt the pull of the place, the remnants of the curse still lingering in the air. But Tommy was right. There was nothing more for them here. They had finished what they came for, and now they had to leave. Together, they turned away from the lake and began to walk back toward the road, each of them lost in their own thoughts. The weight of what they had experienced seemed to follow them, but there was also a sense of relief, a feeling of liberation from the nightmare they had endured. As they reached the road, Kate stopped and turned to look back one last time. The cabin, too, was now silent. No longer a place of terror, but of endings. "It's over," she whispered again, as if trying to convince herself. And for the first time in what felt like forever, she felt a flicker of hope. The journey had been long, and it had cost them all more than they could have imagined. But they had made it through. They had faced their fears, uncovered the truth, and set things right. As they made their way back to the town, Kate knew that their lives would never be the same. But in the end, they had survived. And that was all that mattered. The Blackwood curse was broken. And though the lake would remain a haunting reminder of the darkness they had fought, the truth had finally been revealed. They had won.